So let's take both forks in the road here of what may happen to the court if Trump is elected and if Harris is elected. So starting with Harris first, what do you expect to see from the court under her tenure?
Well, as you know, um, the new president only gets to appoint or recommend new judges, nominate new judges if a judge steps down. We have life tenure, so it's possible that during the entire presidency of a Kamala Harris, that there would be no opportunity for her to nominate a justice, and so she couldn't have that kind of direct impact on the court. If Trump is elected, the same thing holds. He might not be able to appoint any new justices. There are, however, enough justices in the court who are at or near retirement age, so we could have some openings coming up. And if they do open up, then the question would be, how would the Kamala Harris or Donald Trump seek to fill those seats? I think we know what Donald Trump would do. He would try to further increase the conservative hold, the grip of ideology on the court. And I think that what Kamala Harris would try to do would be to restore some balance on the court by appointing a more diverse, inclusive, and also a more liberal, frankly, court.
Yeah, and the rumblings you were referring to about retirement is Justice Alito and Thomas. And should they step down if Trump is elected, he'll likely, appoint someone who shares those same viewpoints.
And this dynamic is on some voters' minds. I asked a couple of them in Manhattan how potential future Supreme Court picks is influencing how they plan to vote in the 2024 election.
What do you think each presidential candidate will do to the Supreme Court if elected?
Well, God forbid if the Republicans, Donald Trump gets back in office, he could possibly stack more people, Republicans, conservatives, on the court. That means we would go back even further than we already have. Women's rights, which have already been stripped away thanks to, abortion overturning Roe versus Wade. It would probably go back further, and, people like Clarence Thomas, who is he's a serious disappointment. He would people like that would probably just make things worse for all Americans, whether most Americans realize it or not.
I honestly don't know. I hope there's change. I really do, because with the way that it's currently is, I'm not very confident in this country, if I'm being honest.
What change do you want to see on the Supreme Court?
I definitely want to see, I guess, more diversity and just like younger people in general. It's always like people not of this generation, obviously, but it's like way older than I think it needs to be. Like I feel like younger people need to be on it, because honestly, the decisions that they're making doesn't really affect them. It affects us, the younger people, because it's things that we're going to have to be living with.
How do those plans influence who you plan to vote for?
Well, like I said, I plan to vote for Kamala Harris. And if any Supreme Court justice were if any seats were available during her presidency, I would hope that she would have common sense, and I think she would have common sense, and pick the right person for the position that could balance out what is now a conservative heavy court. But then she has to present them in front of Congress, the Senate. They have to approve that person. And unless the Democrats take over the Senate completely, then it might be a serious fight for her.
Definitely, yeah. If they make a decision that I don't agree with, and like a presidential candidate agrees with that, and I'm like, I wouldn't be too down with it. There's definitely some things that have been happening recently that I just can't agree with.
Is one of the reasons why the voters I spoke to they have a really low confidence in the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah.
What do you think the court can do to win over more public trust?
I think ordinary people often wonder, how can it be that constitutional law changes when the Constitution stays the same?
Right.
And I think the only answer to that question is it can change because politics change, and because our court is not insulated from politics. We have to keep in mind that our Supreme Court is supposed to be objective and neutral, but how can it be perfectly that? Because a political entity, namely the president, a political entity, namely Congress. They're the ones who get people under the court, and they have definitely a political agenda. So there's no possibility we can have a court that's going to be completely neutral. So given that, the judges themselves have a deep ethical responsibility to rise above the politics of the moment and to really think about what is in the best interest of Americans, and not just some Americans, the wealthy ones or the white ones or the men, but also the women and the poor and the disenfranchised and the immigrants and all of us. So we just basically need a more deeply just and ethical court. But it's up to the individual justices to rise above politics. Our system, there's nothing structural to prevent the court from being political. And that's why the law can change when the Constitution stays the same.
And there's been calls for reform. Your answer is a great segue to asking about that. Expanding the court was tossed around a few years ago. I haven't really heard much about that in recent years. What's your take on court packing and just your general recommendations for reform?
Well, I think, first of all, if we use the expression court packing, it sounds like something evil is happening, because that was a term that was used in the 20th century when the court was faced with the possibility of being expanded. But I don't think that the idea of expanding the court itself is an evil idea. But I would just caution the use of the word court packing, because it sounds like it's something wrong. But what I think is right is that we need to have a structure for our Supreme Court that maximizes the possibility that the court will be that sort of deeply just and fair and apolitical body that I was describing earlier, or at least somewhat less political body that I was describing earlier. A lot of countries have many more justices. There are countries that have 18 justices on their Supreme Court. Israel has a bigger court. India has a bigger court. We could have a bigger court. A bigger court per se wouldn't do the trick if we still have a structure in which a president can choose as many justices as vacancies are open during their presidency, and thereby put their stamp so deeply on the court. So I think actually the idea of term limits may be a better idea than expanding the number of justices. Okay. Term limits would mean that after 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, a new body of justices could come. And that would benefit the public in a couple of different ways. One, it would give more presidents an opportunity to nominate justices, more Congresses and an opportunity to confirm justices, and would also give the court an opportunity to grow with the nation. When you have so many very elderly people deciding our future, then we're going to be stuck in the past. I think one of the reasons why we have some of these bad decisions is not just because of the politics, but because of the generational shifts in our country, which mean that the justices are out of touch with what society's actual needs are. And I'm not saying that elderly people can't make good decisions, but I'm saying that everybody is going to be, to some extent, situated in their experience. And we need to have fresh experiences and the experiences of the upcoming generations deciding the future, not people who are 2 or 3 generations behind.
And I think what I learned from voters is they want more of a say in who the justices are. What is the likelihood or even feasibility of having the Supreme Court justices become elected positions?
Well, many of the states have elected judiciaries. In Pennsylvania, where I live, many of our judges on the state level are elected. And then after they've been elected, there's a somewhat simplified process for having them reaffirmed to continue their terms. And it's controversial because an elected judge might not have to be a lawyer, might not have to have any experience with judicial work whatsoever. And so you do have the problem that sometimes elected judiciaries have less legal expertise than those who are appointed. So you could combine election with qualifications, like you have to be a lawyer, you have to have some legal training before you can become a judge. But I would just be cautious about whether or not the judges that were elected were actually highly qualified. Of course, you can learn on the job, but again, I think that we want, this is such important work, we want people who have training in the complex ideas that constitute our common law and our constitutional law and our statutory law on the bench. So I think that term limits, again, would be great, because you could have judges who are vetted for their qualifications combined with knowing that they don't have life tenure, so they will be more accountable to the public. So that's my take. I guess I'm not so hot on the idea of direct elections for judges, but I'm very interested in seeing the possibilities of a judiciary that was more accountable through term limits, and that was fresher and more in touch with the public through term limits.
Okay.
And by the way, there is a way in which the public can have a direct impact on the court, which is by voting in the presidential election. So everybody, please vote in the presidential election, because the president is the one who nominates judges to the Supreme Court. And then also, I would say that voting for lawmakers, voting for your congressional representatives, is a good idea too, because they have some say-so over the confirmation of Supreme Court justices, especially
Yes.
the Congress, the Senate.
The presidential election is November 5th. Vote however you want, in person, early, absentee ballot. Those options are available to you. You can check your local government websites to, one, register to vote or confirm you're already registered, and to find your polling location.